feel like politicians, government, like local government, I feel like they should get better at like marketing.
Well, I feel like the personality and skill set that you need to be a really good public servant in terms of like organizational skills and kind of liking the nitty-gritty details of things that could be boring to other people are not the same skills that make you want to be in front of a camera. Like, I do not actually enjoy being in front of the camera. I've just gotten used to it. And as I'm in front of the camera right here, like I've just gotten used to it, right? Like, and a lot of it is the context in which I learned to be in front of people on a stage was actually the context of music.
Okay.
And being in a choir, and then later doing like collegiate a cappella and all this stuff. So you end up getting used to like being in front of people in that context. But it also took years before like I wouldn't get nervous on stage.
Yeah.
And that's like even with people on stage with me, right? And then being a soloist, then that's even harder, because if you're a solo in front of everyone else, in front of the band, like all eyes are on you. And if you mess up, everyone will notice.
Wouldn't you say that like that is it's similar because it's like the stage and stuff and everyone's looking at you, but I feel like speaking is just like so much harder because they kind of just like hear what they want to hear.
Yeah.
You know, and that's good or bad.
Yeah.
And then so it's like there's more like judgment sometimes when you're speaking.
Yeah.
Right?
And it again too, it depends on what you're speaking on. Like if it's not something that anyone cares to misconstrue, then like whatever.
But like in politics and stuff, everyone wants to do that.
And sometimes people are listening for what they want to listen for. They hear what they want to hear,
totally.
Or they're like emotionally engaged in it in a way that doesn't allow them to be objective to what they're hearing. And that's like just human nature. I mean, think about like going to people hearing what they want to hear and how polarizing like our pop stars can be, you know. Remember, you know, the era of when Lady Gaga was earlier in her public career, and she was so polarizing, and people would say like, oh, she has no talent, or oh, she's this, she's that, she's not good. But the reality is, in order to be able to produce the type of pop music that she was producing, she had to actually know, like, she had to be musically talented. Right. And it wasn't until like the things that conventionally people look at as quote unquote talented or good. She started showcasing that more. But the thing is, if she would have started with that, she might not have gotten the level of fame. Right. But her voice for people was polarizing. Like people couldn't agree if they liked her or not. And so like not everything is for everyone. And that kind of applies to with other social science and political science type stuff. But it's challenging. And so going back to the skill set that is required to do one thing and the other, like if you're really good at one thing, you might have to work harder to develop the other. And so the skills that you're, you know, required to be a good public servant and do good behind the scenes work, which is really important work, because if the lights are not kept on, so to speak, like people will notice something bad happened and something's wrong and somebody's not doing their job. But that means that you might have to work a lot harder to develop the skills that require you to be public facing, like, you know, getting used to being in front of the camera, like learning how the mic etiquette needed so that when you're at a public meeting that you speak into the mic and people can actually hear you. You're not doing the anti-ADA thing that people do where they like put the mic down and be like, I'll just shout.
Yeah.
Like, no one can hear you. Sorry. Like, sorry. So, you know, and that's just like one little example. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, welcome to the podcast. I hate saying this, but my name's Alexis and this is Jamie. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
So, hi. My name is Jamie Tijerina, and I was raised in Highland Park, Garvanza, Lincoln Heights, and in my day-to-day life, I am a scientific researcher. I work at Caltech. All views are mine on this podcast. I'm not representing those of my employer. And I'm also, outside of this, president of the Highland Park Heritage Trust. So
how did you get started with all of this? Because you do a lot. And I'm always like amazed at everything you do because you do so much. How do you manage just with juggling everything? And actually, how did you get started?
All right. So how I got started, basically, let's go back to 2016. And I had I was about a little more than a year after having moved back home, following finishing my master's program. And moving back during that era was hard. And I think that was a period where gentrification and a lot of the changes associated with that were happening really quickly.
What year was this?
So this was the years between 2015 and 2016. Okay. And I feel like at that point, things started to happen really fast. Mm-hmm. And it was like being culture shocked in my own neighborhood. It was wild. And, it was hard to watch. And I think there's, this idea that you can complain about everything and then just do nothing about it and everything continues, or and that's at that point, that's on you because you didn't do anything about it. Or you can try and get involved, find out what's happening, and see what you can do to improve the situation, right? And so it was August of 2016, and the neighborhood council elections had just passed in my neighborhood, and a seat opened up. I guess somebody must have dropped out, which happens because those are all volunteer boards. And it's a lot of work. And it happens. So a seat opened up and I put my hat in the ring for it and I got voted in. And with that, just kind of snowballed more and more things. So I ended up starting a committee that I called the Culture and Equality Committee. And we just tackled a lot of different social issues, economic issues that affected our community, but widely affected the rest of the city too. And just being accessible to people. So like just learning how to respond to an email within a timely manner, yes. Which isn't like, it should seem not hard. But for some people, like it is, or they just really haven't gotten good at prioritizing or even just being okay with, sometimes you have to give like I will be right with you kind of an answer and then actually do so later. Yeah. And it happens, like people, like I'm not perfect. I'm sure like, I've made mistakes there too, but like a lot of the times I think when you reach out to your public officials, you don't hear back sometimes ever. Yes. And I think
actually happened with us too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I could remember you telling me about this and that you'd reached out to other people and they hadn't responded. Yeah. And so, and I would respond to stuff, but I think that when people see that you're doing stuff, they're like, that person does things. So then you end up being a victim of your own success. And you end up being asked to do more things. Uh-huh. And so that's kind of what happened from there. I got recruited onto the Highland Park Heritage Trust. And so then I started working in that space. I also got recruited onto Art in the Park Los Angeles. So I'm still on that board. That's an arts organization that provides low and no cost arts activities in the Northeast and East side of Los Angeles.
Can you explain what the Highland Park Heritage Trust is?
Yeah. So that is a 42-year-old historic preservation organization that deals with the preservation of the built and natural environment in the Arroyo Seco community. So the built environment being buildings and then natural environment being environment. We were responsible largely along with another coalition of neighborhood folks for getting the only HPOZ in the city of Los Angeles that covers a business district. So the whole Figueroa Street corridor. And
what's HPOZ?
That's a historic preservation overlay zone. Okay. And that's just provides, just in a quick nutshell, since it's a podcast, we're not going to get derailed.
I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. It's going to derail.
Yeah. Like we'll try not to derail it too bad because otherwise people will be like, oh God, like, what am I listening to? What am I listening to? And yeah, so this essentially provides like an additional layer of protection to the buildings that are within that area. So you can't just knock something down because you feel like it and you want to build a thing. Yeah. You have to go through the proper procedures, or like if you're going to renovate something, you could reach out to the Office of Historic Resources and you'll go back and forth with them on the way to responsibly renovate a place that is historic. And there's a lot of other things involved with it too. But we also do historic nominations of important places and in our neighborhoods. So for example, the big one that we got through during the pandemic was in 2021, the Chicano Arts Collectives of Highland Park. And we're also working on a few others. We did the Throop House, which was just one of the last standing examples of its kind of a specific type of architectural style. And we have a few others that are in the pipeline as well, and including a National Register nomination. But we do a lot of things like that. We've also developer accountability. That's a thing that we do too. Accountability to our environment. So if people take out like trees, for example, that are protected, we've written letters because, again, there's a limit to what you can do as a 501c3 nonprofit that is non-governmental. Sometimes it's writing letters, but sometimes it's just noticing things, because sometimes just noticing gets the ball rolling for actual action to be able to take place. Because if you don't know that something's happening, what do you got to start somewhere. So, we'll write letters and bring things to the attention of the appropriate agencies as needed. There was another recent battle that we fought with the community. It was a coalition of us. So Heritage Trust was part of it, the Historic Avanza Coalition. And we were able to get a much better multifamily unit built in the space that was near the Rite Aid, right at York and Avenue 64. Mm-hmm. There was a vacant lot there that had been purchased, and there's a lot of things on the public record. You can Google it. Otherwise, we'll be here till tomorrow, and I'll be telling you this. But but essentially, we were able to take this project and provide accountability to the HPOZ and the requirements that the HPOZ puts forth, and we were able to get just a much more livable project with more green space, better architecture for the people who are actually going to be living in this for generations. Because most of the time these buildings are built and they're going to be here for decades, potentially a century or more. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you start it right. But we also were able to get an additional moderate income unit in addition to what was required, which that's a big deal because that also starts the conversation about like, all right, only creating very low and low income units, that means that there's other people who can't afford to live in the neighborhood who want to, but they're not able to access units that they can afford. So adding another option for affordable housing, that's good. Yes. And having one more unit where there would have been no extra unit, that's also good. Yeah. So, fighting battles like that, that's what we do.
So what did you major in your undergrad and then your master's? What were you focusing on?
So I studied in my undergrad, biological sciences. That was my bachelor's. And then I also minored in music. And then I went back before my master's program and I took an additional year of coursework in psychology. So that included psychology, sociology, and anthropology coursework. And then I went back and got my master in business administration.
Oh, wow.
I think my concentration was business analytics specifically.
Okay.
So.
Wow. You're crazy.
Yeah. Good crazy, not restraining order crazy.
No, totally. Like, that's like amazing that you're just like very well-rounded.
I guess.
Do people ever tell you that?
Yeah.
Like, you got like science, you got social sciences.
But that's like how our world is, right? Like you have all the things are, obviously like one person isn't going to know all the things, but like if you know enough to point somebody in the direction or to be able to like navigate certain types of spaces, like, and have a basic understanding, then it'll get you a lot further than if you're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
like I've never heard of that.
Well, because also like, I just have like, I'm overwhelmed with questions right now.
Yeah.
But like,
we got time, just not till like tomorrow. I know. Not 24 hours time, but we got time.
Okay. What did you want to do when you were little?
I was a pre-med. Okay. I wanted to go to medical school.
Okay.
That's like a whole other issue on like access to education. And also the, people going through difficult circumstances that kind of prevent them from, doing the things they set to do. What is it? Like man plans, God laughs, a little bit of that. So I was pre-med and, life did its thing. It took its turns and things happened that were not in the planner and they were unexpected. And so I ended up working in a research lab. I stayed in Philadelphia where I went to undergrad. So again, I grew up in the neighborhood, but I left for college. When I Ooh, so it's another conversation about like what types of jobs are accessible in our neighborhoods and the lack of opportunities for people after they age out to a certain after they age out of K through 12.
Yes.
Right. And I graduated undergrad in the height of the recession. And so the job market for the cohort of all of us who are coming out was really bad. And a lot of people I knew really struggled to get jobs at all, or jobs related to what they studied. And that included STEM majors. It didn't matter, you know? And I played the numbers game, right? Because I didn't have like connections. Somebody is like, oh, let me call a friend of a friend. That's like not a thing for me. So when you don't have that as a thing, the thing you have is your work ethic and the numbers game. And I put out hundreds. I'm not even exaggerating. It's not hyperbole. I put out hundreds of applications, and in all of that, I ended up getting 3 interviews, and I got 2 job offers, and I took them both because one of them was a full-time and the other one was a part-time. and I worked a lot, and I worked in a research lab. And then I also worked on a research study about childhood cancer, and it was an epidemiology research study about retinoblastoma, which is a rare cancer of the eye that occurs in young children. So I was doing phone interviews in English and Spanish to people throughout the US and Canada about exposures during specific time periods in their lives, which that was interesting, just hearing about people's trajectories, kind of going back to like, how did you end up doing this? And seeing that like everybody has a story, like about, how did you end up being in this role or that role?
Right.
And, you would just see how the trajectories play out, but you also see why these things are being studied, because they could be quite consequential in how things develop, how people develop, and what things, for example, a disease they might acquire, or that they might pass on as a result of whatever they've been exposed to in the course of living life. So I started my career doing all that research work, and then I ended up going back to school. And then taking all the psychology coursework, and then I ended up doing the master's program, and then I moved back home.
Okay.
And I ended up finding work in another research lab, and I've been there ever since. And that has also like afforded me the time outside of work to be able to do a lot of this stuff. So when they say, "What do you do in your spare time?" I'm like, I work for fun. It's just
you
like,
really do.
Yeah, like I'm kind of a workaholic, but I think the other thing is when you're willing to do what other people won't,
right?
It gets you and collectively others pretty far,
for sure.
And and I think the fact that I am like here and that I've been able to do some of the things that I've done in my career, both my day job and outside, is because I've been willing to put in that work. And I understand like a lot of times it's easy to feel the meritocracy is dead, because sometimes there's a lot of context in which it is like, you're not always like putting in the work. You give yourself a better shot at getting what you hope to get, but it's no guarantee of anything.
Right.
But when you go in and you manage your expectations, right, and you're not expecting like that you're going to always win every time.
Yeah.
But you also are just not going in and saying, I'm going to lose.
Yes.
And I think that's the difference. You're like, I'm not going to lose.
Yeah.
And that's
key.
Manage your expectations. But again, like learning, for me, it's been like learning what works for me, so that I can avoid burning out. I think burnout it's really easy to burn out, but it's really hard to recover from burnout.
True.
It takes a lot less time to burn out than it does to recover from it. And so being cognizant of like what it feels like when you're burning out and knowing when to stop, and just like making sure that you do take care of yourself in the course of taking care of others, because you cannot help others unless like you have something to give to them. If you are sick, you're not going to be able to help like
people.
Yeah. So, recognizing those things and just trying to do my best to manage time. And that's an everyday battle.
I'm sure. So you saw the changes that were happening in Highland Park and you wanted to get involved. What was your like main just like thought? Like, I want to make a better community. I want to help improve my community. Like, what was your thought process?
I wanted my community to have the things that other communities had. And, I understand the circumstances in my community in which I grew up in. And I think that there was a lot of things that, we didn't have the same opportunities or the same things available. Like I had started to talk about, there's a gap between or rather a point where once you're out of K through 12, nobody's thinking about you the same way anymore. Yeah. And so you'll notice that I didn't immediately move back home from college. It was the height of the recession. And I ended up staying in another city, in another state, because for someone with a biological sciences degree and no terminal doctoral degree, like an MD or a PhD or anything like that, or certifications, my opportunities were extremely limited. Even with those certifications here, extremely limited in a way that you wouldn't necessarily outright expect. And so I think we have this issue, and I think this has been a brewing issue that just a lot of us don't really get into the space to actually talk about, is that we're sending all of our youth in the Northeast and East Side and telling them, okay, we're going to start these STEM magnet schools. You should go study STEM. You should do this, pursue these careers. But then when you go back and you've graduated, you finish all that, you've taken all the student loan debt, because most of us end up with higher levels of student loan debt than people from other neighborhoods. Yeah. And you want to move home, there's no jobs for you. And if there are, they're not going to pay you what it takes to actually pay those loans off in any sort of reasonable time. And good luck with that. Or if you want to go and do, for example, a PhD program that's fully funded that would not make you have to take more loans out. You don't have all the options in the world, because those are already really competitive to begin with. Right. And so, I think that we're not being fully open with the young students in our neighborhood, the young people in our neighborhood, about what awaits them. But I wouldn't go and, still knowing everything I know, still suggest going into these fields if I didn't believe that these problems were solvable, because I think they are. And I think, by the time that the kids in the current young high school, middle school, grade school cohorts that I've gone to speak to in the last year, if I didn't think there was any hope for them, but by the time they're finished, then I wouldn't do it, because then at that point that would be an unethical thing to do. It would be here, let me send you to your doom. But I think that in decades past, we were sent to our doom in a sense, and not with our eyes open, because the narrative was, if you do all these things, you will find a job and you will be successful. You'll
be rewarded for all of it. Yeah.
But, not. And that's why I don't think the meritocracy is fully dead, but I'm not saying that it's in good shape either. There's a lot of complications towards it. And so that our neighborhood does lack a lot of, for example, the resources, the jobs. We are not designated as a jobs rich area of the city. And the jobs that are being created are not necessarily the ones that afford you the wages that you need to be able to live near your workplace.
Right.
And so looking at things like this, I know that single-handedly, obviously, I'm not going to fix it by myself. That's just beyond, well beyond. But, what I can do is start those conversations, because a lot of the times when I've had these conversations with people, they haven't looked at it in that way, because why there's so many other issues that get a lot more airtime that they would have heard of that first. So, my goal is just to be in the space to be able to do something and not just sit there and complain and have things be the same, and, and not get those resources to us, or not try and improve the situation at all.
So when you joined the neighborhood council, and you're not a part of it anymore, right?
Mm-mm. So I termed out of the neighborhood council, or rather my term ended in 2019. And then I continued as a budget advocate. So that is part of the neighborhood council system. And then from that pool of representatives, then I was an elected budget advocate that represented the entire region, which is Region 8. That's the Northeast and the East Side. And I did that till 2022. So I've been officially outside of the system since then.
What did you learn being in the neighborhood council? I'm sure you learned a lot, but what were some key?
I think, again, no one person can do all the things, right? I think there's, it's not about you as an individual. Yes, of course, you have to take care of yourself, and, you are the one doing the work. So, there's that level of which, yes, that part is yes, you doing the work and taking the action, that's you. But the work itself is not necessarily just about you. There had been times where like, people would ask me to vote on something, and the vote that the community wanted was not the one I agreed with, like personally. Right. And so, having to put yourself aside and your personal opinions and be like, what, this is what people are asking for. And it's not about just me. Like, and then there's other philosophical things like, the tyranny of the majority, because then the people who aren't in the majority, feel alienated, but you're never gonna, that's the challenge. I mean, good governance is not easy. And again, the skill set required to be good at governance isn't necessarily the same skill set that gets you elected. I'm sure there's a lot of examples that we could derail on, but we're not going to do that today because we have, I'm sure, other things to talk about. But, everyone can just go Google examples of that, and it's tough. Governance is tough.
For sure. Our experience at the neighborhood council was pretty wild. That was like my first time. And I mean, it was good because I learned a lot about my community.
Yeah.
Which I think it's important for people. If you're going to move into Highland Park, I think you should attend at least 1 or 2 neighborhood council meetings to get an idea of who's there and just get an idea what these discussions talk about. Because I think they're important for the community. And I mean, obviously you're aware of this too, but there's been a lot of people that just moved to Highland Park because it's trendy, and there's that. And there's also the complicated piece, right? That before it was trendy, it was just that it was affordable. Yeah.
And I think, again, having to like take a step back your own self from how you feel about it, right? So me, gentrification, seeing the changes in my neighborhood and feeling some kind of way about it and feeling culture shocked in my own neighborhood. Like, that's hard.
Yeah.
But then being able to be like, well, I also see that some of these people couldn't afford to live anywhere else. And they're like, this place is affordable. That's
right.
What we got. Like, and so there's that piece, right? But then there's the complicated piece that came in with developers who had bad intentions doing things that are on the record, and you can Google it, talking about things like re-tenanting and trying to target certain types of businesses, usually Latino businesses who had been in the area for a long time, to try and get them to leave, which is really not right at all.
Right.
And so and it's really, really complicated. And again, just there's so much to talk about with it. And, people moving in because it's trendy and then not understanding what was there, understanding the history, even on the most cursory surface level.
Right.
Going to a neighborhood council meeting or any neighborhood group meeting at all.
Yeah.
You're going to get some kind of idea that, all right, there were people here who've lived here a long time. They didn't, they didn't just get here and none of these issues just started.
Right.
There's a reason that a lot of the streets and other things have been in disrepair, because that's decades of disinvestment. Right. And that goes even beyond just the people living in the neighborhood, because those are policy decisions and funding allocation decisions that were and were not made. Right. Because then we didn't get the funding to get the resources that we needed. So
would you say that had to do with the council member at that time?
I mean, it's many council members. I wouldn't even place the blame. One. Yeah, because these things aren't just I think in our public discourse, it's really easy to blame a singular thing, entity, person, place, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think there's this statistic, right, or a number that it's roughly 170 connections are what people every day can handle in terms of people they know and interpersonal connections, right?
Okay.
So imagine trying to, us as humans, regular humans, trying to synthesize the blame for a widespread systemic situation that you're ending up in that obviously involves significantly more people than that. It's much easier to just place the blame on one thing.
Right.
That's why dictators get into power, unfortunately. It's because they're oh, well, this guy says he can save us. Okay, great. That's easy. Yeah. Let him save us. Because the work on the ground is really hard. It's prohibitive. About it. Yeah. And so you can't just blame one singular council member. It had to be decisions upon decisions for many, many years
of neglect.
Yeah. And then again, I've done work on redlining, right? That was a widespread federal top-down policy that affected neighborhoods all over the country.
Right.
And those decisions happened during the era of the New Deal. And everyone talks about the New Deal, but they don't mention that as often. Now, actually, more recently, but when, even 5-6 years ago, it wasn't really part of the discourse in the same way. But, the New Deal had a dark side too. It wasn't all like, oh yes, revitalization and money into the neighborhoods and lifting people up. It unfortunately kind of became zero sum because of that policy and other things. So it wasn't, and that wasn't overnight, right? That was decades ago.
Right.
So you can't say like, oh, this council member was the one, them. Like it's not, that's not it. It's what were the decisions made over the long period of time.
Yeah.
That caused us to where we are.
Yeah.
That caused us to get to where we are today.
Because when I was growing up, Highland Park was so neglected. It was so obviously neglected. And I mean, I also want to ask you this question, like, how do you feel about when people use the word ghetto, or like when people say that it was ghetto, or like, what's your feeling about that?
I mean, ghetto is a complicated word, right?
It is,
because
right?
It didn't originate from just the hood. Like it originated from much further before. Like we look at, when we think of ghettos, we also think about the ghettos that people were placed in the Holocaust, right? And the similar types of conditions developed. And I think that's why, that term is easy to place there, because the conditions were not good. They were bad. And so I think now the term, I think there's one camp of people who have done what a lot of us do. If you don't like laugh about it, you're going to cry about it. And so sometimes they'll use ghetto to make fun of things, right? Like, oh, that's so ghetto. Like, what are you going to do? Like, so I think it's looking at the intention behind how somebody is using it. But I think also being really careful about how you use it and being really thoughtful, like, is it even necessary to use that word?
Right.
And I don't know, right? Like, I'm not going to tell people how to speak, but I'm going to say, think about how you're using the language. And, if that's how you feel about it, then that's what it is. But like for you, but just being really thoughtful about how you use it. Yeah,
for sure. 'Cause I hear sometimes people that were not raised in, a quote unquote ghetto neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I always have mixed feelings about it, because I'm just like, I'm trying not to be so sensitive, but like the way you're using these words for places that you've never even grew up in, I don't feel like that word is for you to use, And
that comes with you discerned an intention that was not good.
Yeah.
So you can feel some kind of way about that, right? Because it's like, and that's when it's okay for you to be like, hey, like, I don't think you understood what it was like here.
Right.
And you don't even have to get into it with them. You just be like, check yourself kindly.
For sure.
But like, you're not wrong to feel that way. Like, they're able to use it, but you're also able to tell them, check yourself, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I was going to say, so growing up, I remember like Highland Park not having crosswalks and like the lights to cross safely. Mm-hmm. And then things started changing, obviously, and there was more money invested into the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, there's crosswalks and there's like more safety precautions for people. And that coincidentally was around the time that, I started seeing white people walking their dogs, and like, just like, I saw the changes slowly happening, and then kind of being weirded out, and then kind of feeling like bitter about it, because it's like, am I not worthy enough to have that in my neighborhood, just as I am?
Well, and it's logical to feel that way. Like it makes you feel really bad. Like, why was when we said something, why wasn't it enough for us to say something?
Yeah.
What made it different when somebody else said something who wasn't us? Like, was it okay for us to live like that? No.
Yeah.
But, I think there were a lot of people who were like, essentially like our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, who were fighting the good fight and they didn't stop. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of it that goes to them too. And it's or a lot of credit to things getting better that goes to them too, and to them not giving up.
Yeah.
But the hard part is understanding where the changes came in terms of the attitudes of the people making the decisions, right? Like, did it come because, a different person with certain money, like, who just was able to pay higher property taxes? Is that what? I don't know. We don't know specifically, but we're allowed to feel the way we feel about it.
Yeah.
And then the flip side, we're also allowed to go in there and try and get involved. And, even though we might take the Pyrrhic victories of,
But it's also true, like what you're saying, like, things are more complex and it's not so black and white.
Mm-hmm.
But because of like those like safety issues that were taken or resolved, the neighborhood became safer, and then I felt safer to walk around and and then it just became so complex that like I still want to love my neighborhood. But there's also just like this complexity of like, maybe it's like the bad people that ruined the neighborhood. A lot of people like to paint it that way, but it's a lot more complex than that.
It is. And then the question is, who are those people?
Right.
Like, there's not like a singular person that's like, it was this person. Like, it's a collective situation.
For sure.
And it's one that we all collectively lived in, but didn't necessarily have the resources or the time to always do something about it. I mean, the other piece of this too is looking at time. And so going back to like showing up to the neighborhood council meetings, there's a lot of issues when you have working class neighborhoods where people are working 9 to 5 and beyond, working multiple jobs, working graveyard shifts. They're not going to be able to come to these neighborhood council meetings to speak their minds, or never mind the free labor required to do all this stuff and to get into the space to actually bring up those changes and to have those conversations. It requires a lot of free labor that a lot of people can't afford to take, or they just straight up they can't do it. Like, there's not enough hours in the day.
Yes.
Like, they have kids, they have other responsibilities. And the thing is, I don't have kids, but I have other responsibilities. I work sometimes really long hours. And, it's, you figure it out, right? Like there's also, but you also can't begrudge those who don't figure it out.
Right.
But it's really hard.
Okay. So you ran for office.
Yes.
What was your position that you were running for?
So I ran for city council in Council District 14 of the city of Los Angeles. Yeah.
And what were you trying to change, or what were your goals?
Well, all right. Going in, I knew that it was going to be really hard because I didn't really have like funds in my campaign, and it's LA City. It's not, a small town or a smaller city. The districts here are the size of like congressional districts elsewhere. And so to reach everybody, you're never going to reach anybody, and a lot of the times young candidates, and especially young candidates, young Latino candidates, candidates of color, they do not have the networks that have the funds that you need to raise.
That makes sense.
And not only that, at that time, the internet was and social media was different. The algorithms have obviously changed since. That's again things to Google, Cambridge Analytica, all that kind of stuff. The 2016 election, blah blah blah. But social media, I think, helped still to like be able to get around the fact that there was like no money in my campaign and that I couldn't raise money, but also that I wasn't out there doing the big spends that a lot of the people who get the like $1, $5 donations were doing. Right. Because I think what people don't realize is that in order to get those and get that recognition, you actually have to spend a ton of money on Facebook ads and like social media ads to get those. Yeah. And like spending $5 on a Facebook ad is not going to get you very much. And so like when we talk about like grassroots campaigns and all of this, well, like, I'm not taking money from X, Y, Z. Like, then who are you taking money from? Because that's like everybody. Like, and so, you know, it's actually, it's really hard, but a lot of people don't talk about how that's actually kind of a privileged position to take for somebody who is from a background that you don't have. Again, going back to, I don't have those kind of connections. Like, that's just not it. And so it was really hard to run, but, you know, regardless, it wasn't about, like, for me, it wasn't about like, I'm against this candidate. I'm against this candidate. I don't care. Like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to talk about the issues. And I knew that, like, I had to look at it in a way that there's no such thing as win or lose here, because like, losing would mean that I like didn't bother, that I let myself get intimidated by all the things that could intimidate me out of it.
Right.
And didn't bother. But there's winning an election, and then there's winning the conversation around things. And I was able to, during that campaign, get a lot of issues on the record that needed to be placed on the record. And I was able to bring I think a perspective, because I came up from the neighborhood council system, right. And also because of the way my campaign went down, because I didn't like go down in the polls. I actually went down because of the signature requirements. And so it was interesting because at the time it happened, so you didn't really hear that often about candidates going down due to not getting enough signatures to get on the ballot. So in LA City, you have a couple ways to do this to get on the ballot, or ballot access. So you can collect up to 1,000 signatures and pay a fee, and then 500 of those signatures have to be good. Or you can not pay the fee and then get up to 2,000 signatures, and then 1,000 of them have to be good. But that sounds...
What does good mean, though?
Valid.
Okay.
So that means that the name matches a registered voter within the district.
Oh, okay.
So there's 250,000 people in a district, right? Roughly, in Los Angeles City. But not all of them are registered to vote. Not all of them are of voting age. And not all of them are easy to, like, go knock on their door necessarily, right. If you live in a multifamily building, things like that.
Yeah.
They're also not going to be home all at the same time. Okay, everybody in the entire city is home from 7 to 8 p.m. in their houses go. Like, that's not a thing. Everyone's everywhere. Like, people work, people have responsibilities, right? So, like, to actually find those people is not easy. And never mind that, once you do find them, that everything is correct. So, like, you know, I had an app that had the voter file, which that's not an unusual thing. And I would like be like, hold on, don't leave yet. Like, I would literally be like, okay. There was one person who actually tried to like leave off their married name, and I was like, you need to come back. Hold on. And so, like, I had over 80% of my signatures accepted, which is insane.
Yeah.
Especially for somebody who, okay. The other way you could do this, you could pay people to get signatures for you.
Okay.
And so at that point, I don't know what it costs now, but at that point, it would cost between $5 and $8 per signature to hire a signature gathering service. And, you know, they're not going to care. They're going to be like, get whatever signatures. They're not going to like do it. Like, thoroughly. They're not going to like say, hey, come back here. You signed it wrong. Like, you know, there's that. And like, I didn't have that kind of money in my campaign. But the other piece is like, you know, if you don't have that kind of money in your campaign, if you do not have like the PTO, because you're working full time, to be able to take 30 days off to go, like, well, it's not quite 30, but many, many days off, so that you could knock doors and gather signatures, or like, you know, walk around town, stand in front of the grocery store, like all that kind of stuff, to find the people who are able to sign for you to get there. You know, it's kind of hard, but never mind that. All of those. So making sure the signatures are valid, that it's a registered voter, a real person who lives at the address that they say they do.
Yeah.
And all of these things that need to be verified. So you could have a bunch of bad signatures and not know until you turn it in and get it back and it's bad.
Yeah.
So to have over 80% accepted and still not make the ballot, it's because I wasn't able to get near 1,000. Like, with that signature acceptance rate, if I would have been able to get to 1,000, then yes, 80% I would have gotten on there. but it was really hard even to just get those. Like you could have people help you, but then they give you like multiple sheets that have, I think it was 20 per page. And so you could give them to like a friend or a neighbor.
Right.
And so I had folks tell me, oh yeah, I could get you 20. And they came back with 2.
Oh no.
And so when you've like made all the like, it's not difficult math. Be like, this person said they could get 40 and they come back with 3. Like, and I had one person straight up ghost me.
Oh no.
Things like that happen, like they're beyond your control. Right. But it's not easy to do it and to say like, all right, I'm grassroots. I'm not going to do all these things. I'm not going to take money from anybody. Like there's a little bit like it's a lot of things that, people don't have an insight into. And so the way that my campaign went down, which was that, I think was really important for people to see, because I think a lot of people were really shocked. Like I was shocked, and yet I also knew that I didn't have a big enough buffer in my signatures because I couldn't get to the 1,000. Right.
Yeah.
And so I was like, we'll see what happens here. We've done everything we can. Like we were out there, as best we could. But I would say getting the issues out, showing people what things look like.
Yeah.
And showing people that, like people don't make the ballot, and that is a thing that can actually happen to you. So that particular election cycle, citywide, 18 people didn't make the ballot, there was a news, LA Times put out an article about how unusual that was.
Yeah.
But the thing is, there's a lot of factors that could go on into it, is that year had a particularly high number of grassroots, brand new political outsider candidates like myself.
Yeah.
And so that could mean that you don't have the resources to like pay $5 to $8 per signature, that you're not taking money from like anybody, because you've said that I'm not taking money from this, that, or that special interest. So that's like not taking money from anybody. Like how, and that you aren't able to take all these time off from work because you were working a non-politics day job,
right?
All of these things. And so that could potentially impact the experience level that people have with doing something as difficult as gathering signatures. And perhaps that's why 18 people failed. But we wouldn't be able to know that until you have more election cycles where you see the same thing. Yeah. And so with the distance of time and the passage of time, we've seen more election cycles look like that, with massive numbers of folks who didn't make the ballot because of signatures. And that's how their campaign ended. So if you don't do the thing, people aren't going to see the thing being done. Right. And so talking about the difficult issues, and also, unfortunately, whether you intend to or not, in this case, I did not intend to not make the ballot, demonstrating that there are issues.
What issues were you focusing on?
So I was focusing on a lot of kind of, again, boring issues. So talking about expanding the city council. Okay. So that's an issue that I think has gotten more traction recently. But my
what do you mean by that? Like, what is
so
that
like? Going back to what I had said about, we have massive, I'd say vast is a good word to use, about the size of our council districts. Yes. We have massive council districts with a large amount of people, and governance is hard. And so when you have large geographical spaces like that, it's going to be difficult to govern. And so we aren't even proportional to New York. So in order to be proportional to New York in terms of representation, we'd need a council of 25. So we have 15.
Okay.
So it would make the geographical area smaller, but it would also make the population smaller of each district. And so potentially one idea is that this would help make it easier to govern and bring more resources to each community.
Right.
That said, there are confounds too, because, you're going to have the issue of, if the pot of resources is already finite, then are we going to create new problems by expanding things? And we don't know, right? But so one of my platform points was something as, kind of boring like that, right? But the other things I would talk about were trying to get jobs into our neighborhood. So talking about the issue with the lack of STEM jobs for our young people who do get ignored in the larger conversation about things. And a lot of the time, not only ignored in the larger conversation about things, but not even a seat at the table. So at that time, I would have been the only millennial on the city council, the first woman to represent that district, because no woman has actually been a council member in that district specifically. Not there's been women on the city council, but not representing the 14th specifically. Right. There were also universal basic income. So there were a lot of things that I was a little bit too early to the party for. So one of them was actually TikTok. I'm the first LA city candidate to ever campaign using TikTok.
Okay.
That's a weird flex, but it's mine. I will take it. And also Twitch, right? So, right. But I was early to the party because TikTok didn't really take off until the pandemic.
Right.
Even though it existed, right? But the other one was universal basic income. So it was at odds with a lot of the Bernie Sanders platform talking points, which was the universal jobs guarantee. You cannot guarantee a job to people. There's too many things that make that not possible, right? But doing a universal basic income pilot study in the city of Los Angeles, that's a great place. This is a great place to do it. A place that has an exploding homeless, like population of homeless people, people without housing. Okay. And at that time, things were really bad. We have rising housing costs. At that time, they were still unlivable.
So what does universal basic income mean then?
So it means non-means tested. So meaning that you don't have to sit there and prove that you do not have funds, because that in and of itself can be really demeaning to people.
Yes.
There is a universal amount of money that is guaranteed to every person from a collective fund to cover basic needs. Okay. And so an individual city at that point in time could not do that for all the population. Yes. But what it would make sense and what was within what I believe to be feasible is a pilot, a small feasibility study. And that was part of my platform. Yeah. And the thing is, it aged well because the pandemic hit. And pre-pandemic, the statistic that I would mention is that the manufacturing sector in the 14th district had lost about 800 jobs. So it doesn't sound like that vast, right? Or that massive in a place with 250,000 people, right? But it kind of is, because 800 jobs could mean 800 heads of household who are responsible for 800 families. And so that's 800 people without work, because those jobs quite literally, they didn't go anywhere. They don't exist anymore. Right. So like there's a lot of buildings that were for factories, manufacturing, that are no longer used for that purpose because those jobs don't exist in this district anymore. Mm-hmm. And so when the jobs are leaving because they're not going to exist anymore, what are you going to do? And then the pandemic hit, and that is precisely what happened. So, the same people who were saying that I was a libertarian Trojan horse were now like, oh, universal basic income, that's great. you know, and so, but this was one of the things that I ran as part of my platform, and a lot of other types of things will be tomorrow, talking about it, but it's on Google.
Would you do it again?
I would do that race. I wouldn't change that I did it. I am really glad that I did it. And yes, if you're like back in 2019, 2018, like, are you going to do this? I'm like, yes. I wouldn't go back and be like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm taking shit. Like, sorry. No. But as far as like in the future,
yeah,
I will never say never, but I don't think I need to run again for office at this time. If it made sense to, if I saw that, like, yes, this is the right thing to do, then I would do it. But it's not in my life plan to be like, I'm going to run for office for sure. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, never say never, but probably not. But I'm glad that I did what I did when I did it.
Yeah.
So.
And it's also, so I don't think people give enough credit to people that come up with these new ideas for like policies, or just like new ideas for just, maybe more equality in communities. And I don't think like other people that maybe they didn't get the seat, I don't think they get enough credit for like maybe those ideas, because then who's to say that a politician in the future could be using some of like your what you were doing in your platform, like they could use your ideas and basically be more successful in the community,
Yeah. And it's like putting the idea out there.
Yeah.
Like
getting
wasn't
people used to it.
Yeah, it wasn't about winning the election at a certain point. It was like winning ideas and trying to get that out there and get it into the consciousness.
For sure.
Yeah.
Do you feel that you've intersected your science background in politics?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of issues that wouldn't seem related to science, but they actually are. One, the housing issue. So one thing that, and again, this goes back to the jobs issue that I mentioned about there being lack of jobs and lack of jobs that pay sufficient amount. A lot of people don't realize that if you're going to go into academia, grad student wages and postdoc wages qualify you for HUD in most major cities. So that's bad, obviously. And that's where a lot of the jobs are concentrated in. And so looking at housing and the cost of housing, affordable housing, sufficient housing stock, what types of housing there are, that's an important issue to science because it affects who decides to stay doing that work and who continues to actually make those discoveries. Because it's not like easy work. Like I think a lot of people are completely not aware of what that work looks like.
Yeah.
But it can be physically demanding. You could be there long hours. For me, sometimes it's like lifting heavy tanks, like heavy manual labor. And I think people don't necessarily realize that. It's not their fault. You can't be exposed to all the things, right?
Right.
Things like, immigrant rights, that's actually quite consequential. I think in undergrad, like if you've gone through a bachelor's degree, at least one international student. And surely at least one who had a visa issue during that 4-year period or 5 years. Some people take longer, but
Yeah.
So people have these issues, and that's a immigration policy issue that if you are not able to convey that, or there's no one at the table with the scientific background to give that extra context as to, just another reason to look at that more closely, that's going to cause problems later. Right. One example specifically of things that didn't seem so obvious when I was on the neighborhood council, as far as the relationships between, one variable and the other, was the Westwood Forward Neighborhood Council. So UCLA, a lot of the students there and other groups that weren't necessarily just the homeowners, but other stakeholders wanted to form another neighborhood council. And so they went to some of the students who are part of the organizing effort went to various other neighborhood councils to look for support in having another neighborhood council. And I remember one of the students was on the neighborhood council of Highland Park. And he was the one who was like, I think that this could be a good thing to bring up. And people said, what does this have to do with Highland Park? I said, well, what it has to very specifically do is that there's not enough housing on UCLA's campus. There's not enough. I mean, it's the early bird special, bars close early, like, things like that. And there's not enough resources for the students. And if there's not enough housing there, then they're going to come to other neighborhoods that, one, are not going to be as convenient for them. So that's actually going to take time away from their studies because they're commuting.
Right.
And it's also going to take time away from their experience because the learning is also like meeting other students, networking, creating the relationships that, might lead to like an entrepreneurial thing after you graduate, or other collaborations that will take you forward into your career and help you become successful together.
Right.
And so if you are living much further from campus than you would like, say in Highland Park, when your campus is in Westwood, that's going to impact your experience. And and it's also going to impact the housing stock in Highland Park. And so, yes, it does affect Highland Park actually. and that made sense because it does. And so, I think that's those kinds of non sequitur like connections are where the scientific background can come in handy.
Yeah. I would also, just like, doing like the research portion of things and having facts to back you up, I feel like politics a lot of time don't have that.
Yes. And that too. A lot of understanding how to look for information that is reliable.
Yes.
And how to, actually one of the big contributions I made as a budget advocate was a paper I wrote about the legacy of redlining in Los Angeles. I'm actually not very heavily published in the field of science that I work in, my Google Scholar page exists because of this redlining paper, because it was one of the earlier papers. It was published with the city of Los Angeles, but it's been pretty widely cited. So like not all the citations are on the Google Scholar page, because that's just like how it is. But it's been cited in media. It's been cited in various like nonprofits documentation about this. It has been cited in scholarly journals because it was an early document talking about some of the ills that policy caused, specifically in Los Angeles, in a way that they hadn't really been presented before. And it wasn't meant to be like the only document that ever exists on this, because that's like antithetical to like research. You want to build upon what's there. But it was a starting point, like starting the conversation, like talking about why things like congestion pricing are actually not really so just as they may seem on the surface. Because when you have a city that's been built for cars and planned out that way, and you have areas of the city that are not where the high paying jobs are, but you have people who are fully dependent on cars living there to get to those places, and those jobs rich areas are not connected well by public transportation because the people living in them didn't want public transportation there. And so they organized to fight it. And they also had plenty of time on their hands. They weren't, bound by work schedules that didn't allow them to participate, all that kind of stuff. Those systemic issues make something like congestion pricing actually unjust, because it creates time poverty for working class people. And so until you actually fix the other root causes, like the lack of the jobs and the lack of public transportation, you really can't implement a policy that is going to cause more harm. So things like that, the student loan stuff that I did touch upon, same idea.
Are you still working on your student loans?
I got public service loan forgiveness.
Nice.
So that was, that happened, last year.
That's sweet.
I did more than 10 years of service, actually.
Yeah, I deserve that.
Yeah. Well, but the thing is, people who work in nonprofit public science, like I do, like I work for a 501c3, like essentially, and I have worked in 501c3, government research, nonprofit research my entire career. And the reason that public service loan forgiveness was put into place, it's actually a Bush era policy, which a lot of people don't realize, because and who would have thought, but it is. And it was because these jobs, like, public science, teachers, firefighters, like, other social workers, these are jobs that are necessary for a functioning society, but they are not paid at the level of wages that are required always to pay off those student loans in a timely manner before you retire, before most things happen that are not good, that would also preclude you from paying them off. So, they had to do something in order to encourage people to be able to go into those fields and stay in those fields. And so the other piece of this was that up until the Biden administration of the pandemic, like I think it was like 99% of these applications were getting rejected, even after the 10-year mark. And so during the pandemic, there was a limited waiver that people were able to go in and correct errors with their student loans so that they could actually get all those years of service credited to them and then actually get that forgiveness. But it's really tough, because when you think about the other things, again, why are those jobs so poorly compensated? Like the systemic thing that this brings up, right? Why is it that like these jobs that are necessary for a functioning society just don't have a way to get the funding needed in order to pay a livable wage to people? And so, I'm grateful that I got it, but I also could have just as well not gotten it if they hadn't actually corrected the issues with the program. And who knows what'll happen like after the Biden administration with this program. We don't know. I would imagine that it would remain, and I hope it does. But, people, I don't think fully understand it. And there's a lot of people who say things like, oh yes, student loan forgiveness is handouts. And it's not, I
hear that a lot.
Yeah, it's not though. And we both hear it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
did you watch the debate yesterday?
No. I have enough negativity in my life. I think all of us do that.
You don't need it. Yeah.
No.
I totally agree. I actually avoided it, but my boyfriend came home and he was just like stuck on it. And then I overheard things. And then I was just like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. All of this.
Yeah, that's not good. Like I said, I did not watch, did not consume this, but I did read somewhere that debates have like a minimal impact on actual outcome for actual election outcomes.
Okay.
And that actually, I don't know where that statistic came from, but I just read it. And I actually, thinking about, having run for office myself, I wouldn't be shocked by that being true. I actually think that a lot of these, again, going back to like the skill set that makes you a good policymaker is not necessarily the skill set that makes you good at getting elected. Yeah. And so at a certain point, it's a show, right? Like and maybe that's why it was so bad, because it's like, is it real? Like a lot of the things that are said during these debates, they're not always factual.
True.
And so, and the other thing is, things that you could be doing instead of debating, you could be talking to actual voters and having one-on-one conversations. True. And I think that's a lot more valuable than like a show.
That's so true.
So it's.
Do you have time for TV? Do you watch TV?
No.
Oh, I figured you didn't.
I'm really bad at consuming media.
I figured you didn't. I'm like, how would she have time?
No,
for that?
I have a Netflix because it comes with my phone subscription, but I do not.
There's this show. It's called The Boys, and you haven't heard of it?
No.
So there's this one guy. His character, his name is Homelander, and if you see memes or something, it's like this guy that's dressed in like an American outfit costume, and he's a superhero. Mm-hmm. And he basically hit a lot of the things that he uses as like hot words is a lot of, I think his character is based off of Donald Trump.
No.
And so it's just like, you hear it and it's just like wild to see parts of the debate and be like, watch him use hot words that will stick to some people that really don't want to put in that time to really like look up or do the research of what he's actually talking about. So he uses an easy word for people to understand, and then people get stuck to like using those words when they don't really know,
Yeah.
And I'm not saying Biden's any better either.
No, I mean,
that was a shit show.
Oh no! I mean, you saw it. I didn't, so I don't know.
I only saw parts of it, and I was just like, "What? This guy can't even talk anymore."
That's wild.
Yeah.
I mean, we're at a rough. I mean, and I don't even think it's just the U.S. Honestly, we're at like worldwide. The politics are not good at all, and I don't know what's going to happen. You don't know we don't know how this is going to turn out. But I think, looking at the way things are, there's a lot of instability. And yet the wild part is that we are still, it's hard to believe, in the most peaceful time in human history. Like, humans are not like the most peaceful. And so that it's insane to be feeling this kind of like worldwide instability, but realizing that things in our history, like humanity's history, weren't necessarily like more peaceful than now.
Yeah.
And it's tough.
So we could wrap up in a bit, but I was curious, what's some research you've done in your science background that's like pretty interesting? And I also kind of wanted to touch a little on COVID, if you like.
Yeah, we can talk about COVID. I'll tell you what little I know. I mean, because I'm not like a COVID expert, but yeah, we can talk about.
How do you think the science community changed after COVID in terms of just, I don't know what terms?
Well, I think this actually is something that I've encountered a lot, especially in the time that I was involved in the neighborhood council, all this stuff, is that a lot of the time people haven't met a lot of scientists. Yes. They just, and it's just the circles they run in, and it's just what it is, right? Like, and so, because they don't know a lot of scientists, they might not necessarily understand that work very well.
Yes.
Not that they don't have a capacity to, it's just they haven't been exposed to it.
Right.
The flip side is scientists are not always that great at communicating things, because the way that you need to communicate to other scientists is not the way that you would necessarily communicate in terms of a marketing campaign.
Right.
And so all of the things, like just like the example that you just gave, that's, sound bites and things that's easy for people to, when they're not 100% focused on something, they're just going to pick up on that and move it along. Right.
Right.
And trying to communicate something like a novel virus for which we have no immunity because it's completely new to all of us, trying to communicate all of that and everything around it is not easy. And it's certainly not easy to change the way that you communicate your, like, the things that you work with or around, or it's not easy to change your communication style to be able to meet that moment. Right.
Right.
And then if you're the only scientist that somebody has met, then they're going to be like, you must know, right? Like, well, I know some things, but I don't know all the things, but also nobody knows all the things.
Right.
Because nobody knows about this virus because this virus is new.
Yeah.
And it's not that nobody knows about viruses, right? Like, obviously there's people who study them.
Yes.
But this is a new one and there's a lot of unknowns. And so to try and convey that uncertainty in a way that makes people feel good is not easy.
Yes.
And to convey the way that research works to people who don't have a lot of experience with it is not easy. So it's going to lend itself to misinformation and the perpetuation of it. So there were things that were for sure handled wrong, like, things like the mask shortages and how the government handled that, right?
Yes.
And that's like a lot right there. But then handling the changes in information. So something might have been true initially, but then research was done and then more information was found out. And so that information changed.
Yes.
But people don't react well to that.
Yes.
Like in society, then they find that to be like wishy-washy or untrustworthy. And so I think having the entire general public have to navigate in that new context, that was a recipe for disaster. So then they're like, well, first they said one thing, then they said another. Yes, but it's because what knowledge we had changed with time.
Yeah.
And then the other piece too is reacting to that and reacting to people saying like, I take X drug that, like for example, the ivermectin, right? Like that was one that people were taking that, but it has nothing to do with COVID. Right. And so people might've heard that in one place, but then it wasn't correct, but they went with it anyway. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, maybe now you don't have the ailment that treats, but that doesn't help you with the COVID. But then having other folks make fun of them for it is not going to get them to stop thinking that. They're going to then feel bad and, react appropriately to how they don't feel good about being judged.
Right.
So there's it's interpersonal conflict, right? Like you can't, it's very difficult to navigate that. So I think that, science in the COVID era really had a communication problem, to put it simply. And it's because science communication is not always what we're the best at as scientists.
Yes.
So what makes you good at science isn't always what makes you good at like being able to get that science out to the public.
Yeah, there should be a science of people that are like neutralizers that can understand the science and then also speak to normal people, just like make it make sense to them.
No, and I mean there are people who like, especially right around 2016, like started to get into science communication a little bit more.
Yeah.
But then again, scientists are quite hard to organize. So there was I'd say it's herding cats was one of the examples that I heard, and it was associated with the downfall of the March for Science that happened in and around 2016. Is that do you hear about March for Science happening?
No.
There we go.
Yeah.
Is that like the way that we argue, like we debate, because that's part of like we do science because we don't know and we want to know. Right. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's also going to be a lot of back and forth. Right. Yeah. And so that in a movement organizing scientists, you're going to have that and it's going to be what it is. And so, there's that, but then, there's other aspects that, again, like for example, my work is in a basement, and I hang out in a basement by myself a lot of time, right? And that's a chill place to be. It's pretty non-dramatic most of the time, which I like.
Yeah.
Right. I think most people like things that are not dramatic.
Yes.
But, going out and doing some of the organizing work, like, for example, around the unionization efforts, not everybody agrees, but also the unionization is not just unionizing, right? It's doing other political work outside of unionizing that gets the funding to the organizations that are funding the asks that the union's going to make. So if you don't have people working with the politicians who make decisions about who funds federal research, who funds the grants that fund the research, then you're going to come up with other issues that are like unintended consequences. Like, for example, we say that we are trying to raise the postdocs' salaries. That's great. That needs to happen.
Yeah.
Shouldn't qualify for HUD with a PhD. Sorry. But the problem is the federal grants that are being given to labs that, they do fund those salaries. Those are not increasing, but the prices of all the things that you need to do the research are increasing, and the wages are increases. Yeah. So then you have this unintended consequence where lab principal investigator of a lab might decide to hire fewer people. And so the issue is then we need to go and lobby the politicians to do something about the funding situation of these grants. But if you have folks not organizing or not agreeing or not being able to like actually organize,
right, then
that's going to be a problem. The other thing is the transient nature of science. A lot of people have to move for these jobs. So going back to everything I said about, there are not enough jobs in certain geographical areas, and also just not enough jobs. You have to follow the research.
Right.
So if you have people who move from place to place every couple of years, or who have visas that put them in a precarious position and that they should not do political activism, and lest they risk their visa status, they can't get arrested at a protest, they could get deported, things like that. It's to be able to organize as a researcher is actually like a privilege point, but it could also make it harder to organize because you're in a place that you don't know the politics of. So like somebody who just moved from like, let's just say like Raleigh, North Carolina, is not going to understand the complex gentrification issues of Highland Park in the same way. I'm not saying that they wouldn't understand or couldn't or don't have the capacity, is that in the same way as somebody who grew up there, because they wouldn't have experienced all of the things that like we just talked about around feeling some kind of way about certain things, because they wouldn't have that same attachment to it.
Right.
But then they also wouldn't have the same context around organizing in those neighborhoods, and to actually make those asks and get into a position where like who to talk to and all these things, you do have to understand the local politics. Like all politics is local. Mm-hmm. It starts somewhere. It doesn't start at like, just saying I visited Sacramento, and what did you do there? There's a lot of cows in Sacramento. Did you like go to the petting zoo and like visit them, or like the farm and visit them? Like you could do anything in Sacramento. Like but like just going, like I visited there once, and it's not going to get you like extra funding into the UC system to help deal with these asks. I visited my congressman, and what did you talk about while you were there? 1 hour visit is not going to get you the increases that you need in the funding. It's like a long-term thing. It's back and forth, and it's everyone doing it. It's not just like, I did it in one district. It's like everyone doing it. But when you have all these things that are confounding, it's going to be really hard. So all of that. And then the misinformation around the science policy, you can see how all of that complexity around that issue would lend itself to people in government not fully getting all the information that they need to make the policy decisions around COVID. Whether they listen to those things, even if they do get it, that's something that's beyond our control, right? You can't force things. But, if they're not even getting that information from like researchers, from physicians, from, frontline health care workers in a way that they can understand,
right?
That's a lot of organizing.
Yes.
That is really hard for people in these roles to do.
True. Totally. I was also going to ask if you think now people have and this is probably true, but people have a different view of scientists and science and research now after COVID?
I think yes and no. I think, again, it's hard to say. I think there's a lot of distrust from some folks. And then on the flip side, there's some folks who really trust. And again, it's how our politics are. It's really polarizing. It's easy to look at things in black and white and find a reason that is very easy to determine. Like
question on question, because you didn't even fully answer. But
yeah, I probably missed something.
No, because I didn't let you.
Oh, that's fair.
Talked over you. Okay. Do you think, this is not what I assume, do you think that, that vaccines cause autism?
No.
Yeah. Right?
That's not a thing.
That's not a thing.
No. Well, and again, I'm not, that research was debunked. So the researcher who did it did some things that were not ethical to begin with. But again, talking about like misinformation, it's hard to like retrain people with the new information.
Yes.
Because they've heard this one thing.
Right.
And they're also like looking for answers. And you tell them, no, that's not accurate. That research was bad. And that's not true. It's going to be really hard to convince otherwise.
Yes.
So
I've come across a lot of people that, at this point, I won't say I'm pro-vax or anti-vax, because I've experienced consequences from COVID, and as of now, like I still have breathing issues that my doctors really can't find what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
But so I wouldn't say I'm like pro-vax. I did get the vaccines. I didn't keep getting boosters or anything, so I just got the 2 shots or anything. But I wouldn't also say I'm like anti-vax, because, looking back, when my mom had me vaccinated and stuff, when I was a kid, I was vaccinated, and I think, some of those vaccines actually helped me, and they helped most people.
Yeah. Well, I think we are far removed time-wise from an era where child death in the United States was common.
Yes.
Things like polio, that's largely been eradicated. We don't have kids in iron lungs. There's still like a handful of adults still living with the iron lung because they got polio and it really like messed them up for life. Right.
Yeah.
And I think we have a lot of distance from that we don't realize that these diseases don't exist the way they did. And the childhood mortality isn't what it was before because of these vaccines. And so that has led an opening point for it's a vulnerability for us that now herd immunity, meaning that the other people getting vaccinated is a defense for those who quite literally cannot get vaccinated.
Right.
Is being threatened because people are not getting vaccinated. It's not that these diseases 100% went away. They were just kept under control by the fact that everyone is largely everyone is collectively vaccinated.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to be like, no, I don't want it when you haven't seen what it looks like. Even with COVID, actually, a lot of people have never actually, or at least in the early part of the pandemic, more accurately, in the earliest parts of the pandemic, many people had never seen COVID because we were quarantining specifically to avoid COVID because we didn't have immunity for it. Not everyone had the ability to quarantine. And so that's why places like the east side of Los Angeles and other areas that were very heavily populated with folks who were the frontline workers and the working class people who could not lock down. Not to say that people who locked down weren't all working class. Many working class people could too, but like it's different professions, right? But certain areas were decimated because they couldn't avoid it. But those who did avoid it didn't really see COVID right away. Right. And so to recognize COVID was actually quite difficult because if you haven't seen one, it was an unusual illness. And there's still a lot we don't know about it. And like what you just described, like the breathing issues, that's long COVID. Yeah. And the physicians are struggling to treat their patients with long COVID because they don't fully understand why some people get it and why some people don't. And they're working on it and we'll be working on it for a while. But also there's a degree to which like there's only so much you can do. It's now a chronic condition that you're dealing with and it manifests itself in different ways.
Yes.
Right. And so like going back to at the beginning, many people hadn't seen it. So it was hard to recognize what it looked like and when it was time to go to the ER. Yeah. Not combined with the fact that part of the disease process is that it makes the person who has it not realize how sick they are until it's too late. So, it's the same idea. Like if you don't know how to recognize how bad something is because you haven't seen it, then you will not really realize what a threat it is to not vaccinate yourself from it. Yeah. And so it was even in the last 10 years talking to people I know who are nurses. And when things like measles started to come back, some of the med students and the doctors had never seen it in their training because nobody was getting it anymore. Yeah. So they were like, wait a second, is this? And there's a resurgence because people are not vaccinating. So yes, again, as me having been and being a scientist in the era of COVID, a lot of the times I am the only scientist that someone has met, and they'll come to me with that. And part of getting people to be more receptive of it is to be non-judgmental as much as possible about having hesitation around the vaccines. Yeah. Because you know what? You should not just blindly accept things. I think that's a general thing, not just vaccines. You shouldn't just be completely 100% compliant. It's logical to be okay, what does this do? What's in this? Yeah. That's fair. Yeah. But it's understanding how to any medicine you take, there's always going to be risks, and you have to realize what the risks versus benefits are. Yeah. And then if somebody asks me, not judge somebody trying to do that. Yeah. Right. For sure. So, I'm so fascinated in more of the science stuff because it's so. You are the only scientist I know that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't think I've ever met a scientist. But we'll end here. If you want, where can we find you? You can Google me. Yeah. My name. But I'm on Instagram as my full name, Jamie Tijerina. And also I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on the app formerly known as Twitter, X, also as my full name. I'm on Google Scholar. I'm on protocols.io. Pretty easy to find. I'm also easy to avoid if you're no thanks. Bye. But yeah, so just find me on social media. You can follow me there. And yeah. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. Of course. Yes. Thank you for inviting me. All right. So we'll close out.